my son, when he was, I think, maybe like in intermediate school, told me about this incident, and we were kind of chuckling together. His good friend at school, his father is a very well-known ENT, ear, nose, and throat doctor on the islands. He's considered one of the best, and so a lot of times when people come in, or famous people come in, they always try to get his help if they need help. Well, it just so happened that there was this one entertainer that came and was seeking his help. He was a singer. Now, this young man was just a teenager. This boy is considered one of the best-selling music artists of all time. He's sold over 150 million records worldwide, and in 2010, he was the youngest male artist to top the charts. He made it to number 1, and he was only 16 years old, and that had not happened in 47 years. Okay, and so he was in the island, the 16-year-old kid, doing a tour, musical tour, and he was having problems with his voice. So they looked up my son's friend's father, and they got an appointment with him to go check out his throat and stuff. And so I don't need to tell you his name, but it rhymes with Dustin Schnieber. Okay, so he gets the appointment. He goes in, and the manager is arranging everything. And so my friend's father, the ENT, he takes a look and examines him, looks at the throat, and everything's done. And, so everybody, the office is all, I guess in hoots. And so finally he gets to close up. They're meeting, the manager's there with this entertainer. And so finally the manager says, "Hey, I heard you have 3 young boys." And he goes, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "Well, would you like so-and-so's autograph?" And he smiled, and he looked at them. He said, "No, thank you." And he excused me. You see, because he wasn't caught up in that fandom. And a lot of times we put people on pedestals, and we can go from, fan to fanatic. And why is it? Why is it that we like to have our picture taken with a celebrity? Have you ever thought about that? Why you want to have your picture taken with a celebrity, someone you don't even know personally? But I think sometimes it's because we like to identify, and sometimes feel because we feel someone is more important or privileged. Like if we can get that picture or that autograph, or somehow, like a little bit closer somehow to them. Like when you show your friends the picture of you with a selfie, with a well-known person, you're thinking, "Yeah, that's right, this is my friend." When we don't even know them, right? I mean, it's just this person we've heard of. And there's this mystique about celebrity, which makes them somehow seem larger than life in our eyes. But at its core, admiration can also turn into idolatry. And sometimes this can even happen even in the Christian circles, right? Where we put Christian, well-known Christian leaders up as celebrities. And there's another danger, however, in elevating someone to a position that really is only reserved for the Lord. You see, when things get tough, we can have a tendency to gravitate towards the things that are familiar to us, or the things which we perceive will cause the least amount of resistance or conflict from others. And that's how it was with the church that is being addressed in the letter to the Hebrews, which we've been going through. See, because many of them, having come from a Jewish background, they were facing persecution and hardships for their newfound faith, especially from their own countrymen, as we had mentioned earlier. And they perhaps lost their jobs, or they were cast out of social circles, and they were not welcomed in certain places. And they still had, as we started talking about, they still had a very high regard for Moses and their Jewish heritage that they grew up with. And maybe, just maybe, they began to think about Moses and how comfortable they were with him, and how much stability he provided them in their value by identifying with Moses. And maybe in their minds, they're thinking, maybe I should just go back to Judaism because I still hold Moses in high regard. And if I do, maybe life won't be so difficult. Now, why was Moses held in such high esteem by the Jews? To say that he was in our day what we would call a celebrity is an understatement. You know, in some lines of Jewish culture, Moses was thought to be the greatest man in history who ever lived. That's how high the Jews regarded Moses. Some other evidence points to the idea that some held Moses to be on a status higher than the angels because he was so close to God. And you know, yes, Moses did have an impressive resume. He had an incredible relationship with God. He was miraculously protected, even as an infant, from Pharaoh. It was through Moses that God displayed a countless number of miracles. He spent so much time with God that when he came down from the mountain, Moses' face was radiating with the glory of God. And it was through Moses that the Ten Commandments were delivered to his people. The Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, were written by Moses. And in his day, Scripture tells us that he was the most humble man on earth. And because Moses was held in such high esteem, some of the Jews were tempted to go back to Judaism. Focusing on Moses' greatness was familiar to them. And it seemed tempting to go back instead of deal with the persecution that they were facing as newfound Christians. Now, why is this important? Because it's important that we learn how to stay focused on Christ and not man. We need to stand firm in our faith, especially in times of trouble and hardship, and look to Christ and not keep our hopes on man or put people on pedestals. But where and how do we get supernatural courage to persevere in our faith in troubled times? And today's passage is actually going to speak to that. And I think there's this powerful message, even for us, as we go through difficult times in our lives, when we're looking like, how do I get strength? And there's this in this passage are just some powerful truths that I think will help us, no matter what we go through, how we can start drawing power and strength and courage when we focus on Jesus. And so let's open our Bibles. We're continuing where we left off. We're going through the letter to the Hebrews. We're in chapter 3. We finished chapter 2 the other week. And so we're beginning chapter 3. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 3, and we're going to go through verse 6. It reads this: "Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all of God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of the house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope." Okay, so that ends the reading. And in verse 1, the therefore is pointing back to what was said in chapter 2, which was all about Jesus as the perfect high priest and the founder of our salvation. And the writer wants to show the audience how Jesus now is superior even to Moses in every way. Now remember, the Jews held Moses in very, very high esteem. And so the first thing that we see as we look, beginning in verse 1, how is Jesus superior to Moses? The first thing we see is that Jesus is superior in his role. Jesus is superior to Moses in his role. So in verse 1, the writer addresses believers as holy brothers, reminding them of their heavenly calling as Christians. They are citizens of heaven, of the new Jerusalem. And it's a reminder that while Judaism was their past, Now, as new covenant believers, as Christians, they have been given new life in Christ. They are citizens of another world. But it's the next statement that is very significant. When the writer says, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. See, Jesus is referred to as the apostle and high priest here in one sentence. But used together, these two terms, when they're used together, these roles point out Jesus' superiority. Now, while Moses was sent in terms of being an apostle and priest under the old covenant, Jesus is the apostle of apostles. He is the sent one. In the Apostle John's writings alone, Jesus identifies himself as the one sent by the Father into the world. And for a very unique purpose, only Jesus could fulfill. Jesus himself is the reason other apostles were sent by God. The arrival of Jesus meant that the Son of God himself is the sent one. The sent one through whom God speaks directly to man. So while Moses was sent by God and indeed communicated messages to Israel, Moses was still an imperfect apostle, an imperfect messenger. You know, when God said go, Moses hesitated. When he grew frustrated with the people, Moses lost his temper. Instead of speaking to the rock, he struck the rock, not following God's instructions, but not so with Jesus, because Jesus obeyed the Father perfectly. Every word that proceeded from Jesus' mouth was truth and exactly what was needed to be said. He was the perfect apostle, the perfect sent one. And while Moses, in a sense, served a priestly function for the people, Jesus is the perfect high priest. The high priest in Judaism was expected both to know God and to know man. The high priest was expected to speak to man for God and intercede to God for man. It was through the priest that sacrifices were made, and it was through the high priest that an offering was made on the Day of Atonement for the sins of the people. So it was a very important function. But Jesus is the perfect high priest in that he, while fully human, was fully God. Jesus is the perfect high priest in perfectly knowing man and at the same time being fully divine. And in this sense, his role as the perfect high priest was superior to that of Moses. So when the writer puts these two roles, apostle and high priest, together, he is saying something very powerful and unique about who Jesus is. You see, like I said, the danger was that the Hebrew Christians were considering going back to the formalism of Judaism, going through the motions of ritual and ceremony, thinking that this would make them right with God and that would draw them closer to God. Now, in our day, it is no different. As you know, I think many people, they like the formality of attending church or participating in ritual in order to be made like they feel right with God, but they miss the point. So the writer now points the people to do something powerful. Look at what the writer says in the second half of verse 1. He says, consider Jesus. Consider Jesus. Now, the word translated into English as consider, used here, does not mean a casual thought like, well, you can consider him if you want. It doesn't mean a casual thought. This particular word, it actually has the sense of fixing one's attention on and continuous observation. In other words, the writer is telling the church to carefully think upon Christ and let their complete attention be focused on Jesus so that they can understand who he is and what his will is. When we understand Jesus' role as the advocate and perfect high priest, what this means for us is to always have our minds and our thinking looking to and deeply considering Jesus. When we begin to elevate mortal men and place them on pedestals, we can let fandom distract us from what is really vital to our Christian growth. And that is the practice of considering or keeping our minds intently upon Jesus. Yeah. Pastor John MacArthur says this. I had to write it because I love the way he says this. He says, the reason why so many Christians are weak and worried is that they do not keep considering Christ, and so his full strength and comfort and guidance is not theirs. And he says, when life gets rough and problems seem impossible to resist, he says, put your gaze on Jesus and keep it there intently until he begins to unfold before your very eyes in all his glorious power. And that sums it up. That captures that idea of considering is when you just gaze and you're so intent on focusing on Jesus and knowing Jesus. The problems that were causing the Hebrew Christians to try to think about maybe running back to Judaism, they disappear because they're starting to know and see Jesus unfold. Now, let me illustrate it to you like this. Many years ago, I remember this store in Ala Moana Shopping Center. You know, everybody remember Iida's? Iida's, yeah, the Japanese store. And so you go down that bottom had the sand pit where all the kids played, and my mom never let us play in the sand pit because they said had all kind of germs and stuff. So you go Iida's, and after Iida's had Sarah's Surf and Shore. Remember, right? When I was, well, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but when I was, in Sarah's Surf and Shore, that was the place to go, bro. Lightning boat shirts, right? Boat slippers, my velour shirts, right? And the shorts, right, and Ripper wallets, right? Sarah's, that was the place to go. We are getting off track. So anyway, we had Iida's, Sarah's Surf and Shore, and if you kept walking down, I don't even remember the name of the store, but there was a store that had a lot of art, prints, posters and prints. And I remember going, and you could walk in there and go like this, and you know how it's in cellophane wrapped on the foam core, and you can look at all the different prints. I remember distinctly walking in there one day, and I saw all these people like this. And on the wall were these new prints that came out that kind of looked pixelated, but all these people were like standing there and staring. So, being kind of curious myself, I went and I saw. And I'm looking and go, what this guy's looking at? Because it was like this picture and it was just pixels. And then somebody explained it to me. They said, no, look at that and keep looking at it. Just don't take your eyes off it. Just keep looking at it and watch what happens. And so, all right. So I did that. It was on the wall. I looked and I kept looking at it. And then maybe after like 10, 20 seconds, an image popped up. But you have to keep looking and gazing and focusing on that picture. And that's how it is with Christ. When we fix our gaze on him and we keep our eyes on him, eventually we start seeing Jesus. We start seeing his heart. So many of us remain weak and fearful because we only give Jesus a passing glance. A minute or two in the scriptures, maybe an even shorter amount of time in prayer, and we don't carefully consider Jesus. May I encourage you to grow in learning to consider Jesus, spending time in the scriptures, meditating on them, extended times in prayer and solitude. As you do, the heart of Christ will begin to emerge. As you spend that time with him, you're going to find comfort and strength in your time of need. You see, but there's more. Not only is Jesus superior in his role to Moses, but the next thing we see as we go along in our passage is that Jesus is superior in his work. Jesus is superior in his work. In verses 2-4, the writer tries to show how in one sense Moses and Jesus were similar. Look at verse 2. It says, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. He describes the faithfulness of Moses, right? So he's talking about the faithfulness of Moses. And Moses was indeed a faithful servant of God. He walked in humble obedience. But Moses was not perfect. Moses had his moments of doubt and insecurity. God needed to refine Moses over a very long period of time. And even then, Moses was not perfect, but he was faithful. But Jesus' faithfulness to the Father is he was perfectly, Jesus' faithfulness was perfect. He was faithful in every way, perfectly to the Father. Everything the Father called the Son to do, he did faithfully and perfectly well. Parents, can you imagine if your kids were perfectly faithful? Like you just tell them once, done, right? I mean, all our kids are like that pretty much, yeah. So bad illustration, no? Okay. Well, in verses 3 to 4, Moses is mentioned as being faithful in all God's house. Now, by house, the writer is referring to the people of God, not a literal building or structure. See, believing Israelites were God's household, of whom Moses was a steward. A steward does not own the house, but simply manages it for the owner. Moses served as a steward of the Israelites. Moses was responsible for leading the Israelites, for giving them the law of God, instructing them, and showing them what God required of them. So in this sense, Moses was faithful in all God's house. But notice what it says about Jesus in verse 3. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of the house, has much more honor than the house itself. And you know, the New Testament frequently uses imagery of the people of God, the church, or all Christians, as comprising the household of God. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19 says, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God," right? That's the imagery of the church. Or 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 5 says, "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious," talking about Jesus, "you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house." So you see that imagery of the Christians being the household of God. But the difference between Moses being a steward of God's house is that Jesus is the builder of God's house. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 3 says, "All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." See, Jesus is not only creator of this world, but Jesus is the builder of the church. And in the ancient world, the architect was considered greater than what he built. In the same way today, we may admire a beautifully designed building, but it's the architect and the builders who deserve the credit for the design of the building. I mean, you guys don't come in here, you wouldn't go and look at an impact wrench and start praising the impact wrench for, a beautiful home. You would praise the architect and the guy who actually built that home with the power tool, the carpenter. In the same way, Jesus is the builder of God's house, which is why he's superior to Moses in every way. Moses was but a steward of God's house, which is why it says in verse 4, "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." But does this really have any relevance to us today? I don't think any of us place Moses above Jesus. Well, I think this definitely speaks to the contemporary church today. Because the principle here is to show the superiority of Jesus and that care be taken in not placing men on pedestals, no matter how successful they may be, even in modern-day evangelical ministry. But with the rise of the megachurch, the focus on leadership development, and the internet, we too can sometimes put too much dependence on popular Christian personalities. But we must remember, I believe it was Charles Spurgeon, I'm not sure if this quote came from him. I love it though. It's, "The best of men are men at best." Isn't that true? Even the best of men are just men at best. And we've seen many a Christian leader fall. We've seen that they're just human. No one is to be put on a pedestal. Even in Christian circles, we tend to credit successful, quote, successful churches to pastors with great leadership skills or great preaching ability or charisma. And here's how I can tell you firsthand how we know this as a pastor. All the conferences that are promoted that will feature pastors of very large congregations and, quote, successful ministries, right? Nobody asks the pastor that is pastoring faithfully a group of 67 people, right, to be the headliner. Because it's all this idea of what they consider success. But remember that the best of men are men at best. And whenever we as pastors, when you meet other pastors, here's the question you always get. So kind of give you guys an inside scoop, right? As a pastor, when you're meeting other pastors and you go to the conferences, they talk, they make nice, and then the question comes, and I go, here it comes. They go, so how big your church? How big my church? What they're really asking is, how successful are you, right? So sometimes, you want to play around. I don't know, 7,000? Why? What does it matter? Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, that's the question, is this idea of how big is your church? But this was a problem even in the time of the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 to 9, Paul writes, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." While we can learn and improve from other churches, we can never forget to consider Jesus. Always. He is the one we look to. He is the one we follow. He's the one that causes growth. And a lot of times we look to man that we've placed on pedestals to try and do things that are not the things that we're supposed to control. As pastors, we're just called, we're servants. We're not there to build a congregation. We're servants. We're here to preach the Word of God. And that growth, I read it to you from Scripture, comes from God, not a pastor's talent. We are called to faithfully preach, and God causes growth. Consider Jesus. Jesus, as we have seen, is superior to Moses in his role as an apostle and high priest. Jesus, secondly, we saw, is superior in his work as the builder of God's house. We are not to take credit for growth in the church. We're just servants. But lastly, we see the ultimate reason why Jesus is superior to Moses. And the third thing is this: Jesus is superior in his relationship. Verses 5 to 6. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Again, in verse 5, Moses' faithfulness in God's house is emphasized, but in particular, the fact that Moses was faithful as a servant. The word used, which is translated here as servant, is unique here because it's the only time in the New Testament that this particular word is used. There's other words that are translated as servant or slave, but in this particular instance, this word connotates a position of dignity and freedom, not a servant as in a slave. It's a position of high honor and of freedom. Throughout Exodus, Moses' faithfulness and obedience is mentioned many, many times. But as faithful as Moses was as a servant, his relationship to God was very different compared to Jesus. See, Moses was a servant. Jesus is God's son. Moses was a servant. Jesus was God's son. Jesus said in John 5, verse 46, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." Did you catch the importance of that? That he wrote of me? Everything Moses did was a testimony pointing towards the one greater to come, God's son, Jesus. And while Moses was faithful as a servant over God's house, God's people, verse 6 tells us, but Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. Servants are temporary, but a son is a son in the family forever. You see, a son will have much greater faithfulness over the things belonging to the father than a servant would. Let me illustrate it to you like this. When my dad was already getting struck down with Parkinson's disease, he couldn't think clearly. He couldn't verbalize things clearly, and it was just difficult for him to make decisions. And so, we had to be kind of extra careful regarding, decisions made and stuff like that. And so anyway, one day, I went to visit my parents in Kaneohe. I remember driving up there, and as soon as I drove up there, I noticed something was off. I looked up, and there's this guy power washing the roof of my dad's house. And I'm thinking, in my mind, brother, what you power wash? Because I knew that whatever needed to be done, I would take care of. So I'm thinking, what is the brother doing power washing my dad's roof, right? And so then I started getting a little bit skeptical and leery. So I parked my car, and I'm so sorry to say, I got to be honest, I had to use kind of my, I'm not so sure who you are voice. So yeah, you guys probably going to think, wow, what kind of pastor are you? So anyway, so the guy's power washing on the roof, and he looked a little sketchy, and so I just went up, and I looked at him, hey, brother, and he went, brrr, and I'm going, brother, and finally he turned it off, and I go, hey, can I ask, sorry, what you doing? And he said, oh, you got to talk to my boss. I go, your boss? Yeah, he's sitting in the truck. So I went down, and I see this guy sitting in this beat-up pickup truck, and so I walk over to him, and I say, excuse me, what are you guys doing here? I go, this is my parents' home. What are you folks doing? And then he goes on to explain, oh, yeah, your dad hired me to power wash. We're going to do the roof. We're going to do, and I said, no. I said, we did not, we didn't arrange for this. And he goes, no, yeah, I talked. So what happened was this guy knocked on the door, got into my father's house. And again, remember, my father, mentally, he couldn't focus, and basically convinced my dad that he could do this great job on repairs. Look, your roof needs work. And that he was going to redo all this stuff on the roof. And he then asked my dad, is there anything else that needs repair? And my dad walked around with him around the house and made a list of all these things that he wanted repaired. And then the guy asked him for full payment up front. And my dad cut him a check because he could still write. He could barely sign his name. And he cut a check for $5,000, and he had given it to the man. And then the man left. And after he left, he still had his card. And I went inside, and I was still a little bit upset, but in front of my dad, I wasn't, and I just sat down with him knowing that, he has Parkinson's, and I just told him, hey, Dad, what happened with this? And he said, oh, yeah, he came around and wanted to fix these things, and so I told him, and he asked for the money, and so I paid him. And so I told him, well, hey, Dad, in the future, if you need anything done, just let me know, and we'll try and take care of it. And I explained to him that normally you don't pay up front everything. And I said, there's a lot of people that take advantage of older people, and they'll do that. And I just saw the blood drop in his face, and he just looked so ashamed, and he looked down, but I just encouraged him. I said, Dad, you didn't know. It's okay. And so I started praying, and I looked at the paper again, and sure enough, the guy collected his check and ran, and then I called him up on the phone, and the guy actually answered the phone, and we started talking, and then he found out I was a pastor. Later on, he started telling me that he used to go to church. And then he got quiet. And then he said, would you like me to return the check? And in my mind, I go, what you think? But I Sorry, I would really appreciate it if you bring the check back. He brought it back. And in front of me, he ripped up the contract. And it was just by the grace of God that nothing worse happened. But I just remember the feeling in my heart of being angry. Is that okay? Like angry that somebody was taking advantage of my dad. And I'm his son. And that's my dad's house. That is the faithfulness, even more so, that Jesus Christ has for the church. And he will defend this church. He is looking out for you, your families, and when you are wronged, he is there in his holy justice, wanting to care for us, his church. No matter what you are going through in your life, in your family, whatever is going on in your lives, know that Jesus is faithful as God's Son, which is why we need to keep considering Jesus. Why are we looking to men, celebrities, to give us some sense of importance and worth, when right there, every day, we can consider Jesus? And we keep staring at Jesus. We keep staring at his word. We keep meditating in prayer. We keep seeking him with all that we have, young people or old, students or seniors. And you guys will start staring at that pixelated picture. And very soon, the more you do it, Jesus will appear. He will give you the strength you need. He will give you the wisdom you need to navigate life. I think that is so awesome. But instead, we trade that for YouTube and Netflix and TikTok and hours spent like this. But what if instead of all those things, we start gazing at Jesus? I'm right. I always tell you guys, everybody says, I don't have time. I'm kind of busy. What you think? I can just read my Bible all day. Well, how much time are you spending on TikTok? How much time are you spending on Netflix? What if we traded just a little bit of that time and considered Jesus? What do you think would happen? I mean, I'm not saying it's bad to watch your K-drama. I'm not saying it's bad to watch a little bit Netflix or a little bit YouTube, but come on. Binge watching? Come on. If you take more time to consider Jesus, you'd be amazed. Think about it, right? I said the average person spends 9.5 hours on media a day. If you were to read the Bible at normal pace, in 80 hours you would get through the entire Bible, just reading it at normal pace. If instead you traded in your Netflix time just for 1 year and instead chose to read the scriptures and pray, you would go through the Bible with ease more than once. And the more you read scripture, the more you are staring at that pixelated screen, the more Jesus starts to come. That is going to change your life. That is why the writer was urging and encouraging the Hebrews, don't go back to your old way of life. I know it's comfortable. You're a citizen of heaven. And Jesus has this whole new world opening up to you right before your eyes if you would just consider him. Jesus is superior in every way to every other leader of God's people. He is even superior to Moses, who is much more. For by his relationship, Jesus is faithful as God's Son. But the writer ends verse 6 with a very convicting and searching statement. For there are probably many who believe themselves in that small house church to be part of God's household. They believe themselves to be saved. and in a right relationship with God, because at one time they had been attending those church meetings, but then for some reason stopped. Look at what it says in verse 6. And we are his house if. Did you catch that word? We are his house if. Indeed, we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. To be clear, we are not saved by works or self-effort. And what the writer is emphasizing is the fact that those who are truly Christians, who are truly part of the household of God, show evidence of this by their continuing to live out their faith within the community of the church. Now, I want to be very careful here. This is not to say that just because someone attends church regularly that they are saved. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that just because somebody attends church regularly means that they're saved. But on the contrary, one who professes faith but no longer continues in the life of the church has a questionable faith. I think that's what the writer is pointing to. 1 John 2:19 says, they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they all are not of us. Gospel of John chapter 8, verse 31. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. 2 Corinthians 13:5, Paul makes it very clear. He says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Basically what Paul is saying is examine yourself. Are you really a Christian? Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test. You see, what the writer of the Hebrews was saying, don't fall away, don't go back, don't stop meeting, because that's what was happening. Many of them just stopped participating in the life of the church. Remember, this is not about church attendance. That's why we don't have roll book where we check your name off. This is about us loving Jesus so much that we just want to keep our gaze on him. And the way you know how Paul says to test yourselves is very simple, that even an elementary school child can understand this. Do you truly love Jesus? Is church just something we go to make ourselves feel good about ourselves? Is church and the life in the church just something we do because we're supposed to? Or do we go because we just can't wait every week to be with our brothers and sisters and ask for the presence of God to be here in this place, to speak to our hearts, to help us when we fail in our hurts and everything, because we love Jesus? You see, only you can answer that question. Do you love Jesus? Do you really consider Jesus? Is he really a part of your daily life? And if you're here today, what a blessing. Same as it is with all the other believers who were called to fellowship together, to be together, to worship the Lord together, and to hear his word together. Don't give up. I know it gets hard sometimes, and I know life overwhelms us at times, and I know it's easy to stop. But remember, it's not your works, it's not the faithfulness in your attendance that makes you a Christian. It's when you truly have Jesus Christ in you, when he has truly changed your heart, so much so that he is the most important person in your life. Give your life to him. Surrender to him. And he will change you as we consider him. Let us pray.